To all of you for your testimony. I'm going to start out with Mrs. Apsey. President Biden's goal of making 50% of all new vehicle electric by 2030 and shifting to 100% carbon pollution-free electricity by 2035. Most people believe that these goals are impossible to meet. Americans don't want and can't seem to afford the dramatic shift to expensive EVs. And 79% of the fossil fuel energy mix can't change overnight. So to you, let's take a moment to talk about the grid. Does the United States currently have the infrastructure in place to even come close to achieving Biden's renewable goals?
Great, thank you for the question. From a transmission infrastructure perspective, transmission serves multiple needs: access to the grid, reliability, resiliency, security, and ultimately, obviously, allowing electric vehicles or the electrification of our economy. However, our grid is not in a state even today to meet the current stresses on our grid, as we've talked about. And given the timeline to build, the time it takes to plan a transmission project to the time we actually put a transmission line into service, on average, if all goes well, it takes 7 years. I gave you an example of a project that has taken at least 12 years. So the challenge, I think, from a transmission infrastructure perspective is that while the utility sector has made significant strides in decarbonizing, I think we've gotten to about probably almost 50%, reduction in carbon. Sort of the remaining distance is the hardest to go.
I think you've answered that question well. You mentioned the Cardinal Hickory Creek transmission project from its delays because of environmental reviews. Why has it taken, hasn't 10 years been enough time to complete that project? Who's to blame in that regard?
Well, the project faced litigation from both local groups and national environmental groups that sought to litigate the portion of the project that crossed federal wildlife refuge. That was the 1.3 miles. And so it's been tied up in multiple court venues. And at the same time, we've been urging the federal agencies to continue to do the work so that when we received the outcome of the court ruling, we could be in a position to expeditiously move forward with the remaining construction on the project. At this time, we are still awaiting the federal agencies to take action on the remaining permits. While we're hopeful that we can now move to quick action, we're somewhat at the hands of the federal agencies.
Mr. Hergott, Biden has prioritized preferred green energy projects by government subsidies and concerted regulatory effort to what he calls to end fossil fuels. However, just like fossil fuel projects, renewable projects face years of permitting delays. Why shouldn't permitting reform be at the top list of anyone's concerned about climate change? And during your time at the administration, did you notice any renewable energy project delays stemming from Democrat inaction?
Thank you for that question, Senator. I'm often perplexed at the situation we find ourselves in on the permitting debate. This isn't like gun control or social issues or Social Security or the science of climate change. This is an apolitical, science-based issue, and we're using the process as a rhetorical tool to stop the projects that you don't like. Is not an effective way in which to adjudicate which projects go where. And what we are seeing with comments that are coming from my friends in the administration that I work with when they say, we don't have a problem with NEPA. 95% of all NEPA reviews end up in a categorical exclusion. That is misleading, right? The reality is that most of those projects that are being talked about are smaller, lower level projects at the Department of Transportation and do not take into account these large scale energy projects, which is why when in the administration we had to put our finger on the scale on Vineyard Wind and several other projects to get the Department of Interior to accelerate the time of doing these regional EISs. And I think that what often we find in this situation is that we stop treating capital being put at risk to build all infrastructure as partners, and we started to look at them as adversaries. And I think that there's going to be a tremendous move to make this issue a truly bipartisan issue because of the $10 trillion investment in infrastructure right now. $8 billion is renewable energy, and on average, it is suffering about a 7 to 10 year delay. This is no longer a Republican issue, and I'm almost surprised in many ways that Republicans push permitting reform because it should be coming from the other side.
Governor, I'll have a question for you in writing, if you'd please respond to it. I yield.
Next, just for the information of my colleagues, after Senator Kane, it's Senator Johnson, Senator Padilla, and Senator Braun. And for the record, I have not given up hope on bipartisan permitting reform. My site